Hello there. In today's video I'm going to be making a hunting knife out of a blunted file. This first video will cover the forging, grinding, and heat treating. Before filming, I had annealed this file by heating it up to glowing and then letting it cool slowly. This removes the heat treat and helps prevent stress fractures from forming during the forging. What I'm doing here is lengthening the tang of the file such that it can run the length of the handle. I'm using a hardy tool here to cut some shoulders so that there's a clean distinction between tang and blade. The hardy tool causes the blade to mushroom out around the cuts, so every so often I take it down and flatten it. Now that the cuts have reached the appropriate depth, I'm using the corner of the anvil to beat down the high section between the cut and the tang. You have to be very careful here not to strike the shoulders of the blade. If you do, it's not the end of the world, it just means a bit more filing. With every metal there's an ideal working temperature. This varies from steel to steel, and when you're working with scrap you never really know for certain. To be on the safe side, I generally like to stick around bright orange or dull yellow. It's really interesting the way the camera picks up the colors. This is not how it looked to me during the forging. Now I'm switching to a different anvil. This one has got sharper corners and will make it easier to work the metal near the shoulders. I'm trying to make the tang at least as long as the palm of my hand, and I'm also trying to give it a smooth, even taper with very few hammer marks. Measuring the length is convenient for me as my hand is about the width of the anvil. Now that the tang is finished, I'm going to decide how long I want the blade and how much excess I need to cut off. Any markings I make on the piece won't show up when it's glowing, so I mark it on the anvil instead and then use my hammer to transfer it to the hardy tool. I'm almost all the way there, so I'm just going to fatigue the metal to break it off. Make sure you find the cutoff and stick it in your water bucket. I know a fellow whose shop burnt down after he misplaced and forgot about a cutoff. Now I'm working to bring the blade to a point. I'm only working the point from one side, such that the blank will look a bit like a box cutter or a medieval sax. I'm not making one of those, but my reasoning will become apparent shortly. In addition to forming the point, I'm also tapering the blade in several dimensions. Adding distal taper is really easy on the forge and it's kind of tricky on the grinder. The file that I'm working with is not ideal. It's rounded on one side and flat on the other. As such, the edge is off-center. I'm using a swage block to bring the edge back on center. Now I'm going to make sure that everything is nice and straight before I start forming the edge. Now I'm forming the edge. You have to strike at an angle here, and I'm working along the shoulder so that if I miss I won't dent the surface of my anvil. As you form the edge, the blade will naturally bend backwards. I use a wooden mallet to straighten it. A wooden mallet has the benefit of being able to bend steel without deforming it very much. This keeps you from undoing your precious work. This bending of the blade is the reason that I made the point forward initially. Simply by hammering the edge, it will bring the point back to where I want it. If I had started with the point where I want it, I would have to struggle to keep it there, but by planning ahead I can work with the steel rather than against it. Normally I just judge the thickness by eye, but for your benefit I got out a ruler. You want it to be thinner than 1/8 of an inch at the edge, but thicker than 1/16 of an inch. And the more hammer marks and blemishes that you made, the thicker you want it to be, so that you have the spare material required to grind them out. The blade is just about right now, but the tang's gone a little bit crooked, so I'm just going to fix that in the vise. Just tapping it very gently because I don't want to deform anything. Now, before I go to the grinding, I'm going to anneal the blade to make sure that it's as soft as possible before it touches the grinder. You heat it up to the point where it's not magnetic, then you bury it in the fire, cover it in coals, and walk away. Just let your fire burn down. The blade will be good and soft by the time everything's cool. Now here's my blade blank. It doesn't look like much, but it doesn't need to. The grinder's where the finish and polish comes from. First I'm going to grind the edge to the shape that I want it, smooth out all those wavy sections and the hammer marks along the tang. After about a minute or so, the blade will become too hot to handle, at which point you just dunk it in the water. Now I'm switching to the corner of the grinder. The corner of the grinder is good for removing a lot of material quickly. The drawback is that it's really easy to gouge the steel, so you want to use the corner at the beginning so you got lots of time to fix any mistakes you make. The corner of the grinder is also essential if you want the back of your knife point to be concave. Cleaning up the edge a little bit more. The blackness left by the forge is a really good marker of areas that need grinding. You want to keep the blade moving against the grinder at all times so that no gouges can form. If you've got a specific section you're working on that needs a little bit more pressure, you can get a little block of wood to push against it. Making an even transition from the flat to the point is really tricky. You have to pivot the knife out from the point. Grinding the edge of the knife is not tricky. You just rock it back and forth along the edge until a nice edge forms. Grinding is by far the most time-consuming portion of knife making. The forging process from start to finish took about half an hour. The grinding process took about 2 hours, and it can take a lot longer depending on the level of finish you're going for. It can be absolutely infuriating trying to grind out some tiny little blemish or hammer mark that just seems to get deeper and deeper no matter how much steel you remove. So here's the blade following the rough grind. Looks pretty good, there's a little wavy section in the middle. But with a bit of care we can get that out during the second grind. I'll spare you from watching the second grind as it's just the same thing but with finer sandpaper. Now I'm going to use a file to clean up the shoulders around the tang. It is absolutely essential that these shoulders be perfectly square, or else the handle and fittings won't sit properly. Now I'm going to go over it with a bit of sandpaper to smooth out any uneven sections. Now back into the forge for the maker's mark. You put the maker's mark in after grinding so that you don't just grind it off. Now we're going to do the heat treating. This is the most difficult and nerve-wracking part of forging a knife blade, particularly when you're working with scrap, as every metal heat treats differently. Before we harden the knife, we want to let it relax a bit, relieve any tensions in the blade. This will hopefully prevent the blade from cracking when we quench it. To do this, we heat it up to the non-magnetic point. We try and do this as evenly as possible, and then we let it cool. Then we repeat the process 2 or 3 times, and hopefully by that point all the tension will be relieved. Now for the hardening. We want to heat it up to the non-magnetic point and then dunk it in the water quickly. You want to keep the knife moving in the water so that a bubble of steam doesn't form around it and prevent it from quenching properly. You also don't want to quench the tang. Once you've quenched it, you stick it in the vise and let it cool to the point where you can touch it. You have to be very careful with the blade when it's like this, as the slightest bump could shatter it. I didn't do a great job with the hardening. The blade took a slight warp. If I had been on top of my game, I might have been able to fix this quickly. What can I say? It's really tricky to do time-sensitive things and film at the same time. Next thing to do, I go over the blade with a wire brush. This will make the tempering easier. Tempering removes a portion of the hardness from the blade. You do this by applying a small amount of heat. Eventually this heat will cause the blade to turn yellow, purple, or blue. This layer of oxidation is how I judge the temper. If you've ever turned a drill bit blue, this is the same thing. This is another area where you need to use your judgment. Generally speaking, you want the edge to turn yellow and you want the back to turn blue. But once again, it varies depending on the steel you're using and how well you did the hardening. So here it is after tempering. Looking back at the footage, it's a little bit more yellow than it should be, and it's nothing like as even as I'd like it to be. But this is where I stopped, so come what may. Now that I've tempered it, I can try and fix that slight warp. I have to gently bend it in the vise. Man, is that ever frustrating. I could come up with my excuses. I could blame the camera, could say I got overconfident. The simple fact of the matter is I screwed up. I'm of half a mind to just redo the entire project, but let's try and make lemonade instead. I only lost about 1.5 inches, so this isn't the end of the world. With a bit of care, I can grind a new tip. I can go back to the forge and give it just a little bit more temper. A big part of craftsmanship in general is learning how to deal with and salvage mistakes. Setbacks like this might be frustrating, but I still come out with something nice at the end of it, even if it's not the way I intended. That's it for part 1 of this video. In part 2, I'll be making the handle, the sheath, and other fittings. Bye-bye.